Welcome back, designers. This is your first of 3 lectures on typography. Now, typography is a fancy word for typefaces or fonts. And fonts, letter forms, are an essential resource for graphic designers. Along with images, typography is probably the most important element that you will employ as a designer. Today, in 2020, there are an almost limitless library of typefaces that you can choose from online. When we get into more about printing in the past, you'll learn how that's changed over the years, but suffice it to say for now that there's a bunch of stuff out there that you can use. So to choose a particular font in response to a certain project you're working on requires a knowledge of letter forms or type. And so to help you with that, we're going to look at the origins of letters or typography and how it has evolved over the millennia. So let's see, in order to watch this little video from YouTube, I need to mute my sound or I come out sounding very funky indeed.
Type is power. The power to express words and ideas visually. It's timeless, but always changing. And that's what we're going to explore. Most people agree that the creator of typography was a German man named Johannes Gutenberg, and yes, he wore a hat like that. Before Gutenberg came along and revolutionized the world of communication, books needed to be scribed by hand, usually by monks, which was very time-consuming and expensive. So Gutenberg created blackletter, the first ever typeface, modeled after the writing of the scribes. Blackletter has thick vertical lines and thin horizontal connectors, which made it great for scribing, but it looked very dense and squished together when printed. Something needed to change. Enter Roman type. This particular typeface is Cambria, which you're probably used to seeing on your word processor, but the first ever Roman typeface was created in the 15th century by the Frenchman Nicolas Jenson. This is his typeface right here. Jenson worked mainly in Venice, Italy, and was inspired by the lettering found on ancient Roman buildings. His letter forms were based on straight lines and regular curves. This made them very clear and legible compared to the dense darkness of blackletter. This legible new typeface was an instant success, and quickly spread across Europe, riding on the coattails of the Renaissance. The next major innovation in typography after Roman letters was italics, which are like slanted and stylized versions of Roman type. They were created in the late 15th century by Aldus Manutius from Italy as a way of fitting more letters onto the page and saving money. Now we use italics interspersed in Roman type for emphasis. Aldus Manutius also created the modern comma and semicolon, but that's another story. Type development stayed fairly stagnant until the 18th century in England when William Caslon created a typeface that set a new standard for legibility. While it wasn't anything radical, it was just what the world was looking for. The style of Caslon's typeface is now referred to as Old Style. A few decades later, another Brit named John Baskerville created a new variety of typeface which we call transitional. Later still, a Frenchman named Didot and an Italian named Bodoni created typefaces that we have classified as modern. Most serif typefaces fit into one of these 3 categories, but what does each category mean? An old-style typeface has letters that have thick serifs and low contrast between thick and thin strokes. A transitional typeface has letters with thinner serifs and a higher contrast between thick and thin strokes. And a modern typeface has letters with very thin serifs and extreme contrast between thick and thin strokes. Next, William Caslon's great-grandson, named William Caslon IV, got sick of all of these serifs, so he decided to remove them entirely and made a new kind of typeface called a sans serif. It didn't catch on immediately, but would eventually get really big. During the Second Industrial Revolution, advertising created a need for new typefaces. Letters were made taller and wider, mainly used in large sizes on posters and billboards. Things got pretty weird, but one happy result of all of this experimentation is Egyptian, or slab serif. It has really thick serifs and is usually used for titles. As a backlash to the complexity found in typefaces of the 19th century, the early 20th century brought something simple. Paul Renner from Germany created a typeface called Futura, and it was based on simple geometric shapes. This is called the geometric sans. Around the same time, a British man named Eric Gill created a typeface called Gill Sans that was similar to a geometric sans, but with gentler, more natural curves, and this is called a humanist sans. The next major step in the world of sans serifs happened in Switzerland in 1957 with the introduction of Helvetica. It has simple curves and is available in many different weights, and some would call it the world's favorite typeface. The world of typography changed forever with the introduction of the computer. There were a few difficult years of crude pixel type due to the primitive screen technology. But then technology evolved and computers began to allow for the creation of thousands of beautiful typefaces. And the odd dud. But now anyone has the freedom to create their own unique typeface. And that is the history of typography.
Okay, how about that? I thought that was a very succinct way of getting some key points across to you. Okay, so as the film alluded to, we can tell, or more than alluded to, told you, there's a difference between fonts, and there's ways to tell one from the other. And we would call that font anatomy. And there are about 25 plus, quote, anatomical terms that you can apply to letter forms or type. But for general typography, it's not necessary to know all of them. No one's really going to quiz you on, the vertical emphasis of your font or require you to do, a certain kind. But there are a few key ones that are good to know for when you're selecting a font. And sometimes you get in a situation where a client will send you a font and say, hey, can you match this for me and find out the name of it? And to be able to examine it, some of the finer details, can be helpful. So let's see. Okay, so let's start off by talking about type anatomy. Now there are lots of different terms for the different parts of a font. I'm not going to require you to know too many of them. In fact, there's two that I've whited out on the bottom of under the A and the F there because you don't need to know them. But most simply, the cap height refers to the height of a capital letter. The X height refers to the height of a lowercase letter, basically. And it's called an X height because it's based on the height of the X in the letter. Because you'll see when you look at some fonts that there's some slight variation in the height of some of the lowercase. For example, if there's something like a C or an O or something curved, it might pop up a little higher on the top than something that's flat on top, like a Y, for example. So anyhow, cap height, X height. Baseline is simply the line that they all sit on. And that is very, very, very important, and it will come into play a lot as a designer. And the serif, we're going to get to that in a second. I just didn't want to X it out because it's important. This reiterates a few of the points I already made, but adds to it the ascender and descender. An ascender is, as we see in the K or the D, extends past the X height, and the descender, like the Y, goes below the baseline. Overhang is just a pretty simple term for, I mentioned the curved shapes before. If they push down below the baseline, they refer to that as an overhang. You see that in the D and the O. Okay, and these are helpful to be able to, like I said, identify, and these are the details that you can look at when you're deciding which fonts to use. Now, intuitively, you'll know very often why one font works better than another. And I point to the article I'm going to have you read, the quick online, the link that's in your assignments, about how we respond to fonts. But just, the word is modern, so obviously the one on the bottom is not modern, so it doesn't really go unless you're being ironic. But we're not being ironic right now. So that's one that you just know. But when you get into something like this, which one, for example, is more, quote, correct, end quote, for your uses, sometimes knowing these finer details can come in handy. So So we have type classifications. Each of the various classifications have different earmarks, we call them, or distinguishing characteristics within that particular classification system. We'll get to those, what those are in a second, but I just have two very different fonts here to show you what we're talking about. So you'll be able to intelligently talk about what the differences are between a font pair like this. And you'll be able to, and this is what you'll want to be able to say to someone, is that defend why you chose something. You chose this beautiful 18th century Benoni font because you liked the vertical stress and the high degree of contrast between the thick and thin strokes, and that it has a humanist quality that is appropriate for the particular design project that you're working on. And I know you don't understand what all that means at the moment, but that's about as far as you're going to need to go with being technical, describing this to any non-design person. All right, so as a movie mentioned, we started with black letter, which was based on actual printing by, most of the time, learned people were religious clergy, monks, and the original printing was based literally on their handwriting. That became really hard to read, and so we moved to serif, which was based on more classical forms, but it's still considered humanist because it still tries to emulate in some degree the classical calligraphy that it's derived from. So there's two major categories, serif and sans serif, which we'll get to in a second. This is serif. Now a serif, as I mentioned briefly when we opened, is that. It's a spur. And there's 4 you can see on that A there. I did not circle all of them. But that is literally what a serif is. Okay, so then the serif evolved as time went on to have more contrast between the thick and the thin letter strokes. This is transitional, which is came after the old style serif. This is more 18th century. And I know the movie got some of this, so this might be a little bit repetitive, but I just want to make sure that you all hear this. And that's when I talk about a thinner part of the letter stroke. It's there as opposed to the big heavy area on the right. So that's also, it's a more bracketed, more sharper serif than we have in the other one. As we can see when we compare the two of them, you can see how there's more contrast between thick and thin on the right, and that the serifs are more bracketed, more sharper. Okay, we moved into a modernist, where it gets even more extreme, and then we can compare all 3 of them, progressing from left to the right. And like anything, it just develops over time, and more people get involved, and you get more hands, more designers were working on type. It was getting more popular. So that's where we are today. There's like 3 different serif groups. Actually, there's 4, one more coming up. All right, so what happened, the Industrial Revolution meant that there was a much larger need for visual communication, for typographic communication, and that the existing fonts we used in books just weren't cutting it, and they were also fairly limited to an elite sector of the population that read, and we, or they, needed to appeal to a wider audience. You can see, for example, the need for bolder, stronger fonts to do things as simple as, have an advertisement like this. So one of the developments was the slab serif. Now this is still considered a serif because it has the little spurs, but you can see how blocky they are, and that they're just cut off as opposed to the gentle curve of the earlier serifs. And the point of that is they're easier to print, because when you get these fonts much smaller, sometimes those thin serifs that we saw on the other ones disappear, and these do not. They're just more industrial quality. And also they jump out more. When you look at something like that, people are trying to sell stuff. They're competing now with each other. They're not just setting text in a book, so they want something that's going to jump out and get the viewer's attention. So I moved even farther into the sans serif, which I won't go into the definition since the movie told you that. But once again, the Industrial Revolution was responsible for it coming to prominence. There was a philosophy that was sweeping the world at this time, particularly the U.S., that equated traditional letter forms with all that ornamentation as excess and with the rich and with the money class. And there was something about the simplicity of these sans serif types that appealed to the masses because they were clean and functional, and they were just non-fussy. They were workhorse fonts. They did not put on airs, so to speak. So all fonts are part of a font family. For example, the name of this font, and that's actually the font, it's what is it? A serif or sans serif? That's right, it's a serif font. It's called Baskerville, and there are different versions of it. There's irregular, italic, semi-bold, semi-bold italic, bold, bold italic. And every font family, not everyone is different, but most can be different. For example, here's one for Helvetica. Light, light, oblique. Now oblique is just another word for italic. Light, light, oblique, regular, regular, oblique, bold, bold, oblique. They're all going to be somewhat different depending on the type house, and the type house basically just means the manufacturer who created the font or who worked with the designer. So one of the benefits of sans serif fonts, another reason they became this workhorse font, is that they are able to have so many more variations than, say, a serif font. And this is particularly important because usually you buy a font by the font family. And so once you pay for that family, you want to be able to, you don't want to have to keep buying other fonts, so you can get all this variety within one font. So that's just an economic reason for it. Plus, you often, for aesthetic reasons, you don't want to have too many fonts in any design. So these, although they are different versions, they still maintain a lot of characteristics that keep them all in, keep them all within. They still have a lot in common, so that there's just a visual unity to when they are used together, as opposed to mixing one of these with like a serif font, for example. So that brings us to font choice. How do we choose a font? So technology can help us, but also hurt us. In addition to producing digital versions of classics like Baskerville or Helvetica or Garamond, it has also accelerated the creation of brand new fonts. We often call them novelty fonts. Now, display font, as we've already discussed, I'm sorry, we have not discussed that yet. I know it already, but you do not. These are ones that we might use for a headline or use for a word here and there, but probably aren't really useful for, say, a paragraph. I mean, can you imagine reading an entire paragraph of text with this font? I mean, I can't even read what the name of it there is. Not New Jupiter. I'm not sure what that even says. Anyhow, there are so many choices out there, and that sometimes can make choosing a font daunting because some of these new and shiny ones, they want you to use them. But just beware, because a lot of these are experimental. They don't have a lot of versatility, and they also lack a timeless quality. People are used to, when you're designing something, you want to make something cool, but you also don't want to draw too much attention to any of the elements in it, because your greater goal is that product you're selling or that event that you're promoting. You don't want the font to take over. So don't get dazzled by the flavor of the week, basically, is what I'm saying. So, for example, I mean, which of these would rather read a whole book of? I mean, okay, so you're picking a font. How do you pick a font? Font choice. Design clarity is essential. One of your main jobs is to get a message across, which means you need to be clear. So, and this goes back to those novelty fonts. Some of them might look cool, but if you can't read them, what's the point? Very simple. Consider how much space you have. If you want a message to jump off the page, which means you probably want the font larger than smaller, you might do something like on the right, because it's condensed font, a condensed font. It can be larger in this vertically oriented or portrait oriented, we call it. Those black squares or rectangles are portrait orientation. The one on the right allows you to have a larger and therefore most people would consider more impactful visual. What overall feeling do you want? Sans serifs and slab serifs can often be seen as more authoritative just because they're just bolder and they demand your attention. So if I'm saying just do it, which of these are you going to listen to? Say the one on the left. Ah, look at that. Also, reversing out type. Sans serifs are often much better for type reversal than serifs. I don't have a great example of this, but sometimes when you have too delicate a serif, it can fill in, and then you can't really read the letter anymore. Take my word for it. Also, what size are you using the font? If it's going to be very small, this is another example of how sans serif at a very small size is easier to read than the serif. One on the right is actually slightly bigger, and it's still, you can see what I was talking about with filling in. If you look at how the thinner parts of the serif are starting to disappear a little bit, as opposed to the one on the left. So those are practical things you have to think about. There's also font suitability, which we already talked about when this started. So your choice of font can be influenced by the subject matter. And often knowing the origin of a font can help, particularly say that Caslon was from England and that Garamond is French. That's less so. I mean, we don't hold ourselves to that sort of thing, but if you're doing something that's particularly, about Italy or France, it's also good to know. So in other words, it's good to know something about the history of fonts. The design format and ergo who is reading it is also important. For example, with this, let me see, where do I go here? No, this Rolling Stone, that's created for a younger audience. That's not going to be in a magazine for in ARP or for seniors, because they're not going to want to read that. They probably can't read it. I'm grossly generalizing about older people's ability to read more innovative type design, but generally it's not going to be as playful as this. So know your audience when you're picking a font. You need to consider how much text you have. For example, picking a font for a headline is very different than picking a font for the main text of a book. How much is the person going to read? In which case you have to consider the readability of a font. And very often serif fonts, now this is also a generalization, but often the common thinking with book publishing is that serif fonts are a little bit easier to read than sans serif. So the one on the right is probably, if you pull out some of your books at home, you're probably going to see more of them set in sans serif, or I'm sorry, in serif, like the one on the right. Sans serif is more popular than it used to be, and it's certainly the workhorse for online content. So if you're reading a book online, it's probably more likely it's going to be sans serif. But those are things that you have to consider. Display fonts, which I alluded to before, is just a more expressive, artistic font, I guess, like the Chris Rock one there. It's less concerned with readability than it is with expression. It's more trying to get its point across. And again, the readership, people who are going to get this magazine are going to maybe take the time to sit there and try to figure out what that says, as opposed to someone who just, like, say, reads for utilitarian purposes, like the newspaper every day, doesn't want to mess with interpretation like that. They don't want something necessarily fun. So anyhow, display fonts often emphasize expression over the readability. So yes, you can mix fonts, and yes, it's less is generally more. It's safer to combine different variations of the same font that are within the same family, which is what this page is showing you. Take the first line. Those are all the same universe font. Those are different versions. You can see there's the light condensed and in the bold condensed, italic and non-italic. Because they have so much in common, you can mix them to get the variety, but they don't get so far away from each other that you disrupt the visual harmony. They still have so much in common that they seem like they're from the same place. They're more like siblings than they are cousins, for example. So they're just going to look more alike. And once again, for more elegant, just a rule of thumb, less is more when it comes to choosing fonts in almost any situation, unless you are purposely designing something to look kind of crazy, maybe a little junky. Mixing fonts across font families is also permissible, but a lot of the same rules apply. You don't want to go overboard. But by the same token, you want to have a reason for what you're choosing. The author of this page thinks that the bottom one is a type crime because she doesn't think that, for example, Mr. Potato Head and Mrs. Pear Butt, that those two fonts, you can see one's a little bolder than the other, are different enough to warrant using them. And that makes sense to me. They're still so close to each other that kind of like, what's the point? If you're going to spend the time to go back in your document and change the font, you want it to be more like, say, the first line where you see the voluptuous wife is so different from Jack Sprat and his. So there's a reason for it. It doesn't seem sloppy. It seems really thought out. That might be. Oh, there's just another example of an artistic example of combining fonts. Another one. It's 3 different fonts going on there. Actually, 4 different fonts going on there. But it works. There's different hierarchy of what's more important. It's easy to read. And this is the last example from the New York Times, and it's a very content-intensive page, and it mixes 4 different font families from all over history. And there's an Egyptian bold condensed, I think the word events, yeah, that's the word events, and then there's I think I have it larger, yeah. You can see it better here. They're very diverse ingredients, and they're mixed. There's different scales, different sizes of the type. Creates it really sets certain information apart. Like the red information is always a certain font, and the events is a different font. And you see edited by Emma Purse. That's a different font. Different kinds of information have different kinds of fonts. This is not something I'm going to recommend beginner designer try, because it gets to be a little bit too much, and it does take some finesse about knowing how to mix them without going overboard. Once again, you're safer with less is more, particularly at the early stages in your design career. Okay, so that's it for the first lecture on typography. There are 2 more. I bet you can't wait. Go do the quiz, and we'll hit highlights of this in the next class. Bring any questions that you have. And that's it. So take care. I will catch you all soon.